Hello, it's Mike from Vitreus Art here. It's Monday, so it must be time for a video. And today's video, I'm going to be talking about glass cutters. Probably no subject as contentious as which cutter to use in which circumstances as glass cutters. Maybe soldering irons divides people's opinions quite a lot, but cutters is definitely the thing that most people will have an opinion on who have worked in glass at all. The first one we'll talk about is this, often called a Shaw's glass cutter. It's got a mild steel wheel, and the thing that everybody says to us whenever we show them one of these is, oh, my granddad had one of those, he used it in his shed. And in my opinion, that's where it should stay, because it's not really good enough for stained glass. The reason for that is this is designed to cut window glass, greenhouse glass, that kind of stuff. Glass that's completely flat, no texture, no internal irregularities or anything like that. As well as that, the mild steel wheel will blunt quite quickly. So even if you had quite a lot of these in your toolkit, you're going to get through them at quite a rate. Whereas the tools that are designed for stained glass cutting and for cutting the glass you'd use in glass fusing will last so much longer that the economic question just doesn't even come into it. So this kind of cutter, you dip it in oil, some kind of cutting oil. We use white spirit ourselves. I'll explain why a bit later on. It does do the job. It does cut glass, but as I was saying, the steel wheel blunts fairly quickly. It's quite a big wheel as well. Can you see that? If you compare that to the kind of wheel on a stained glass cutter, the difference in the size of the wheel means that effectively when you're pressing down with a smaller wheel, it's concentrating the force you're pressing down with onto a smaller area, a bit like the way a stiletto heel will make a mark in a hardwood floor, because it's concentrating the weight of the wearer in a small area. The old-fashioned type of cutter, the Shaw's type of cutter, the size of the wheel works against you in stained glass. And also, it's not that, even when they're new, they're never that sharp. So they're not really very good for the kind of textured glass you'd use in glass fusing and stained glass. So I would park that one. I wouldn't bother using that one, except for the ball. Come back to that in a moment. So what kind of cutters could you use for cutting the glass for fusing or for stained glass? We tend to use Toyo cutters ourselves quite a lot. We have other examples as well. We've got a few cheapies that we've been given over the years, or that we've picked up from somewhere, I don't know. We've got a couple of quite expensive ones as well. But what I'm talking about today are the kind of cutters that most people can afford and would want to use in their everyday work. First one is this pistol grip cutter. This is a Toyo. Toyo is a Japanese company. And this is called a TC600. The head on this doesn't fit their other cutters, so remember that. A couple of key advantages of this one that some people really like, and I'll be upfront, I don't really get on with this one myself. I find it quite difficult to control. That might be because this cutter is really designed for use for long straight cuts. So you see these a lot in glass shops, window shops, glazing places, because it's really good for very long cuts. The fact that it's got quite a big handle means it holds quite a lot of cutting oil. Fits in a hand like that. I find personally, I don't like the lack of control. Other people do a much better job than I do using this one, so don't laugh too much if I don't appear to be very competent with this one. That's because I've spent the last 17 or 18 years using something different. But if, for instance, you find that gripping a traditional oil-filled cutter like that is a little bit difficult for your hands, then perhaps this is the answer. Fits in a hand like that, you can grip it quite strongly. If you learn to control it, it's a pretty good tool. I know Jenny uses this from time to time. So that's the pistol grip cutter, Toyo. Next one up is the kind of Toyo cutter Jenny and I started out with. This is just called a super cutter. Has a large chamber for oil. It has their TC10 head, which is their standard head. And this is pretty good for everything you might want to do in glass work. It feels quite weighty, which I quite like. When I use fountain pens, I quite like a pen that's got a bit of heft, and this has too. So this is a pretty good cutter, but there are a couple of evolutions of this, and I'm going to show you that I think actually are better. These are about 20 quid in the UK, so it's a pretty good tool, and the heads on these will last you quite a long time, and of course you can remove them. You see the little screw on the front there? That's the TC10 head, which fits the majority of the Toyo cutters, so you can keep a little stock of heads. Slightly moving on from that super cutter is what they call the comfort grip cutter. That's this one. It's not the colour that's different, it's the shape of the handle. In every other respect it's the same. You've still got the oil chamber in here. You've still got the TC10 head, their standard glass cutting head with a very, very small wheel. But the handle is chamfered so that it fits more comfortably between the finger and the thumb, like that. Now, the point of that is that it's a little bit easier to hold for the majority of people. Is there a great deal to choose between them? Not absolutely convinced. I certainly, for a long, long time, I used to use one like this. In fact, I've still got my original one from whenever we first bought our first kits of tools. That's a long time ago. And it still works. I've changed the head once, I think, but only once. So it's a good, long-lasting tool, and the chamfered body to the handle does make it sit in the hand between the finger and the thumb a little bit more comfortably than the super cutter. But there's not a lot to choose between them. Either of those will last you a lifetime and do a good job. And the wheel, it may look similar to those you find on the really cheap tools like the K-Stars and so on, but it's a much, much harder tungsten carbide wheel than you tend to find in the other cheaper cutters, and that makes the difference. It gives you a cleaner cut and it lasts a lot longer. So always go for a tungsten carbide wheel at the very least. Moving on from that, this I think is probably the one I want to spend time talking about. This is the Custom Grip. This is also a Toyo. This uses a different head though. This is a TC21V. There's a couple of differences about that. Firstly, note that that head, the TC21V, doesn't fit on any of the other Toyo cutters, and the other Toyo cutter heads don't fit on this. So if you use one of these, you need to make sure you buy the head that goes with this cutter. The reason it's different is that the tungsten carbide wheel is on a slightly eccentric axle, so it bounces up and down a tiny bit, a bit like a pneumatic drill when you cut glass with this. You might be able to hear the sound. Sounds slightly different. And the point of that is it reduces the amount of pressure that you need to apply when you're cutting glass. Now that, combined with the shape of the handle, it goes in the hand like that. So the black plastic part here goes in the crook of your finger and thumb. And the point of that is it separates where you're controlling from, that's here between your finger and your thumb, from where you're pressing from. And that's pretty good for people who perhaps haven't done this before, people who don't have so much strength in their hands, people who have a little bit of arthritis, that kind of thing. We definitely find in a teaching environment, this is the cutter to use because it makes the difference between comfortable cutting for a morning's worth and less comfortable or perhaps an unsuccessful cutting. Often this cutter is the thing that makes people realise that they can do stained glass when they might have tried before. Perhaps they tried with a more traditional cutter and thought that they wouldn't be able to do it. It's surprising how often that's the case. Often when we have people who are concerned that their lack of strength or control or some arthritis in their hands might make it impossible to do stained glass, we invite them in, give them one of these, give them a quick demo, show them how to cut some glass with it. They have a go themselves and they come away thinking, oh, actually I could probably do this. And then they book on a class and then they have fun and then they get started and they're away. So that's why we tend to use these Toyo Custom Grip cutters in our classes. Now it was for quite a long time, I used to use my own version of this, the Comfort Grip, the Toyo. And then I realized after a little while that actually my reservation to this was just that initially it felt a little bit odd, and it does. Once you get used to it, you don't notice, but to start off with, it might feel a bit unusual. And I realised actually there was no point me teaching students with one type of cutter and then asking them to use a different type of cutter. So pretty quickly we switched to a class's worth of these, the Custom Grip. Never looked back. Nice, easy tool to use. One downside is that the chamber for the cutting oil is a little bit smaller. That's the full size of it from there to there. So you do have to keep an eye on the level of the oil in there. If it runs out, you won't get a good clean cut. I'm always amazed that some people seem to manage to cut glass without using some kind of oil. Most people don't. You may well find that the oil comes out quite generously. This one, it's a brand new cutter, this one actually, and the oil is coming out quite a lot. You can always turn the cap in a bit. But overall, I'd say that's a pretty good tool. And Toyo, they say, don't know how I would ever prove this, Toyo, they say that the head will last about 6 miles worth of scores. That's probably going to last quite a while. We do change the heads on ours quite frequently because they get quite a lot of use in a teaching environment, and they get a certain amount of abuse possibly as well. If you keep the head refreshed, that cutter will last you a long time. And although it costs a bit more, these are about 25 quid, a super cutter is about 20 quid, a cheap Chinese copy is about 10 quid, and a Shaw's is about £3.99. The amount of glass that you'll avoid wasting by using a proper cutter would easily make the economic argument for buying a better quality cutter from the start. Now there are plenty of far more expensive cutters. There's the Schnittke. You can spend up to £100 on a glass cutter. Is it worth it? I would say that's pretty arguable. I would say the technique and your skill and a certain amount of planning in advance to create your designs and plan your cutting so that you're making the best use of the glass will save you way more money than buying a fancy cutter. You might like to buy a fancy cutter, but I would argue it's probably not really necessary. Maybe a choice of braking tools might make more difference. We'll talk about that in another video. So I think that's about it really. I'm going to keep plugging the Toyo Custom Grip because we do find that it makes a lot of difference for our students and for ourselves. The only other thing I would probably say is that you may be tempted to buy cutting oil, and it's a bit like snake oil in the sense that there's always somebody willing to charge you quite a lot of money for some cutting oil. It's a bit like sewing machine oil. It might well actually be sewing machine oil, and it's not really necessary. It's quite viscous, so in some of the cutters, combined with the dust that you get from your cutting surface, it often means that the head gets a bit gummed up and you have to clean it out with an air spray. I would suggest instead white spirit. It's much less viscous. It does the same job in lubricating the cut. You can keep it in a little pot, so even if you're using a cutter where the oil feed isn't very good, like on these on the cheap on these K-Stars for example, you can just dip the cutter in the oil. Oh, this one has got a knackered head. Right, I'm going to throw this one away. Instantly, as soon as I started to score, yeah, that feels terrible. Right, that's in the bin. Okay, so we won't talk about that one anymore. I didn't put any oil in that one. That's my regular super cutter, that one. So I was talking about white spirit before I got distracted. It's cheap. You can put it back in the bottle when you've finished. It's not so viscous that it gets gummed up in here. It is a bit flammable though, so that's the only thing to watch out for. I think that's probably as much as I want to say about the cutters. My abiding message is buy cheap and you buy twice. Get a decent cutter. The amount of money and frustration and time you'll save by having a better cutter and learning how to use it properly will easily be repaid even in the first year, let alone throughout your career in stained glass. Thanks for watching. See you again.